The death of a friend, serious mental illness, and a vicious heroin addiction had a 20-year-old future superstar homeless, destitute, and at the end of his rope. A desperate cry for help that became a breakout smash for the artist, affectionately called JT, next on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you've ever synced The Wizard of Oz with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon or been curious about that, you're going to want to subscribe below right now. I pulled that one out of nowhere. Because here you get the inside story of your favorite songs, most of the time straight from the artists themselves. This is just for music fans, so subscribe right now, hit the bell so you never miss out, and help support our mission of curating rock and pop history by clicking on our Patreon link below. You'll dig that. We have more content there. You know, one of my favorite quotes that I champion any chance I get is this one from Albert Einstein. The human spirit must prevail over technology. One of the most intelligent individuals that ever lived profoundly and incisively concluded that the invisible and unscientific human element is the key substance for our survival. As world technology advances and continues to dominate our daily lives, the human spirit is more critically vital than ever for our emotional and physical well-being. For me, there is nothing better to fortify the soul than the human spirit evoked from music. That's what this channel is all about. It's what my mission in life is. A song or even a profound melody is what I go to for spiritual nourishment every day. And there are songs on my most cherished playlist that give me a variety of inner strength to help me prevail over anything. One of those songs is definitely Fire and Rain, the breakthrough composition that forged the legacy of one James Taylor.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
I experience an exhilarating range of emotions whenever I listen to JT's Fire and Rain because to me it's more than a song, it's a prayer. I'm not talking about religion here. I'm talking about when the soul reaches outside of the body, yearning for something greater than human understanding, stretching beyond our limits. I feel the longing of a beloved friendship whenever I hear that song, a devotion to faith and to the people that I love. I am moved by a sense of survival to overcome life's biggest challenges and a perseverance to build strength and achievement. Few things give us that capacity. In my estimation, music definitely does. If one goes or does a deep dive into what was going on in JT's life when he wrote Fire and Rain, you can't help but crave the song's magnetic emotional euphoria. Now, there are three specific movements in Fire and Rain that represent the inspiration JT poured into the song. This song breakdown is sponsored, by the way, by Zenny Eyewear. As their slogan says, trendy not spendy, for less than the price of a vinyl record, you can level up stylistically. Go to zenny.com to see. So let's get right into it.
I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end.
Starting off with the shocking news about the suicide of JT's dear friend Suzanne, or Suzanne Schneider, eulogized in the opening line of Fire and Rain. Just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone.
Just yesterday morning, they let me know you were gone.
It wasn't until 6 months after the tragedy actually occurred, though, that James Taylor's friend disclosed the awful news to him. People close to JT purposely held back the news because James was working on new material for his fresh deal with Apple Records in London, and they feared that after he received the word about Suzanne, he would go off the deep end, thus potentially ruining his promising career advancement. Suzanne Schneider was a beautiful woman from Long Island, New York, that James Taylor developed a strong connection with over several years. And the two had just a special kinship between them that was cultivated in their mutual struggle with depression. They fed off each other for support and for comfort. Now, during the course of their friendship, James and Suzanne were both psychiatric patients suffering from mental illness. While James was in London, Suzanne was reeling from what proved to be an insurmountable mental breakdown, and the hospital officials put her in an isolation cell. Suzanne couldn't take her pain any longer, and she took her own life. She was only 20 years old. The revelation about Suzanne's death was devastating for James, as expected, and he put his grief and his deep love for his friend into his music. The death of Suzanne Schneider is well documented, but there are two lines that James wrote in Fire and Rain that have sparked a conspiracy theory. It's the second line in the first verse that conjecture. Suzanne, the plans they made put an end to you.
Suzanne, the plans we made put an end to you.
Many began to wonder about the plans that, the song referred to. But the line that really confused James Taylor's fans was in verse 3. Sweet dreams and flying machines in pieces on the ground.
Sweet dreams and flying machines in pieces on the ground.
The conspiracy theorists believed that Suzanne lost her life in a fatal plane crash on her way to London to surprise James at one of his concerts. That's the urban legend, even though that urban legend has been conclusively debunked straight from the mouth of James Taylor. That claim is still going strong throughout the internet. Again, one of those rock and roll urban legends that goes on and on. But we know the truth. The second part of James Taylor's emotional masterpiece deals with JT's crippling drug addiction that grew to an alarming level at the gateway of the Sweet Baby James album. As a teenager, James Taylor was a bright student, but he was plagued by severe depression. By the time he turned 15, JT was performing at coffee houses and other nooks in Massachusetts and North Carolina. He duly impressed those who saw him perform, but he had a really tough time with school. Because of his natural intelligence, James was admitted to a college prep school, but couldn't handle the constant scholastic pressure. He went back to a public high school, but he continued to grapple with just debilitating insecurity and depression, which led to him dropping out of his high school during his junior year. James Taylor ultimately earned his high school diploma when he was a bit older during one of his stints in a psychiatric hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. The Taylor family had its share of turmoil, which intensified JT's woes, but he was also predisposed to a family history of mental issues and addiction. His family had an extensive history with opioid abuse. They even owned a sanitarium intended to help members of the family break a drug habit. James's father suffered from alcoholism, and his older brother Alex had a similar war with substance abuse that derailed what many thought was a very promising musical career, and it led to his untimely death at just age 46. Now, the third part of Fire and Rain was James Taylor's disclosure about coming to grips with fame, reflecting on the path that got him to that pivotal point in his life when he had to deal with the pressures of the music business without succumbing to his demons. Throughout an artist's career, you will have highs and lows. It's a roller coaster ride where you can be on top of the world one minute and at the lowest valley in the very next. The fleeting nature of fame is something James Taylor had already encountered in his young career multiple times, but the time that he was 20 years old and expressed it in the chorus of Fire and Rain. Oh, I've seen fire and I've seen rain. I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end. I've seen lonely times when I could not find a friend. But I always thought that I'd see you again.
But I always thought that I'd see you again.
The rain came down in buckets in the life of James Taylor when his band, The Flying Machine, didn't make it past the demo stage. Musician Danny Korchmar formed The Flying Machine with James. The two met as teenagers and played small gigs as an act named Jamie and Cooch. Cooch convinced Taylor to check out of the McLean Psychiatric Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, after a life-saving 19 months, and moved to New York City to start the group. The group became The Flying Machine, and it was the drummer, Joel O'Brien, who introduced J2 to heroin. And his dependence on one of the most addicting opioids began. It was O'Brien who was the carrier of more despair in London, as he was actually the person that delivered the grim news to James Taylor about the suicide of Suzanne Schneider. The failure of The Flying Machine devastated JT. It was one of his low points in his life, exasperated by his depression. The aforementioned lyrics, Sweet Dreams and Flying Machines and Pieces on the Ground, that's actually a reference to the demise of the flying machine and the crushing of high hopes. With no band and an insatiable dependence on heroin, James Taylor fell into a cycle of recovery and relapse. When defining this period of his career, JT stated that he learned a lot about music during that time and too much about drugs. That was his quote. To ward off depression as much as he could, James hung around and played guitar in New York City's Washington State Park. He seemed to completely let down his defenses, allowing runaways and criminals to stay at his apartment and get high with. His manager abandoned him at that moment, and James became completely destitute. In an act of desperation, James called his father, pleading for help. His dad flew to New York City and staged a rescue, putting James into a rental car and driving him back to North Carolina. James spent another 6 months receiving treatment, and he made a short-lived recovery. He also needed a throat operation to fix his vocal cords that were damaged by singing improperly. James Taylor decided to work on being a solo artist. At that time, he moved to London in 1967. He was only 19 years old. After that stint in rehab, JT decided to work on becoming a solo artist and used a small family inheritance to move to London. JT recorded some demos in Soho, and his friend Danny Korchmar provided a much-needed sunny day when he used a connection with the band King Bees to hook James up with Peter Asher. Asher was the head of A&R for the Beatles' Apple Records. He was also formerly with the band Peter and Gordon, if you remember, who had a string of hits in 1964 and 1965, including the worldwide smash World Without Love that sold over 1 million singles.
I don't care what they say, I won't stay in a world without love.
Now, Asher played JT's demo for the one and only Paul McCartney and George Harrison, and the two legends loved his sound. McCartney recalls being very impressed with what he heard on that demo. What stood out to Paul McCartney was JT's wonderful voice. Apple signed JT to a deal, and he recorded his eponymous debut album on the Beatles label. And then more rain fell. JT's self-titled record was a flop. Apple Records was already on the skids by the time the record came up, so the label was not able to provide much promotional support. Combine that with JT's fragile emotional state, and the prospects for success proved nearly impossible. Taylor returned to the States, playing some festivals, and began generating some acclaim when he fell into the abyss yet again. He was riding his motorcycle near his home in Martha's Vineyard when he was in a violent crash, breaking both of his hands. James could barely strum a guitar or even hold a writing pen without tremendous difficulty. JT healed and moved in with his then-girlfriend Joni Mitchell, but soon after he checked himself into the Austin Riggs Center in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, James wasn't able to kick his habit, but his time at Austin Riggs was very fruitful for his songwriting. During his 5-month stay at Austin Riggs, James turned 20 and wrote the music for his second album, the legendary Sweet Baby James, including his anguished plea for help, or his prayer for mercy, Fire and Rain. Won't you look down upon me, Jesus? You gotta help me make a stand. You just gotta see me through another day.
You just got to see me through another day.
My body's aching and my time is at hand. I won't make it any other way.
And I won't make it any other way.
I want to stop right there and talk about that for a minute. I want to express a heartfelt thank you to James Taylor for this song and that line. I know I'm not alone in my feelings. I know many have been healed by his words, his music. There was a night several years ago after I found out that my dad had experienced a terrible stroke and that he wouldn't make it. He would survive for a few more days on a respirator, but there was nothing that the doctors could do. There was no hope for a miracle. Coming to grips with that was just devastating. I'd just seen him days before, singing songs in the car on our way to dinner. How could this be? It was a long, dark night of the soul, and I felt helpless. I felt immense sorrow. There was so much I wanted to still do with my dad, so many memories left to create, so much left to say. I felt completely numb, couldn't sleep, couldn't find any peace, nothing could help me. As Elton John would once say, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, damn it. Thank God my music was still alive.
Thank God my music's still alive.
That's where I turned. The familiar chords of Fire and Rain. They started to thread its way through my veins, enveloping my entire soul. When the second verse started, won't you look down upon me, Jesus? You gotta help me make a stand.
Jesus, you gotta help me to make a stand.
I had to tell you, the floodgates were just pulverized by the sweetest of emotion. The memories of my most treasured experiences with my father played, from the film projector of my soul. And I finally felt the tender mercies coincided with God's heavenly light, which turned my anguish, my tears into an overwhelming peace. My soul was propped up by this miracle, and I was able to make a stand. He would help me through another day.
You just got to see me through another day.
The very next day, I traveled to the small town that my dad had raised me in, and I was able to lie next to him. And I shared this song and so many others that he had shown me, that he raised me on, and I said my final goodbyes to him. And I'm so grateful to James Taylor and his beautiful, perfect song that was the vessel to me in my trial, because as the song says, I am certain I wouldn't have made it any other way. It turned my devastating sorrow into just joy and peace.
I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
Now, the Sweet Baby James LP was produced by Peter Asher, recorded at Sunset Sound Los Angeles as part of a fresh deal with Warner Brothers Records. Taylor would be paid once the album was delivered in its entirety. He was essentially homeless while they were recording Sweet Baby James, either staying in Asher's home or sleeping on a couch at the house of his loyal friend Danny Korchmar, or anyone else who would have him, for that matter. As the album's producer, Peter Asher's vision was to give the record a stripped-down vibe, to showcase James Taylor's talents as a singer-songwriter. The supreme singer-songwriter, if you ask me. To achieve that sound, Asher enlisted Cooch on guitar, Carole King on piano, and Russ Kunkel on drums. Kunkel was really a hard-playing rock drummer. And while they were rehearsing Fire and Rain in Asher's living room, Asher asked Kunkel to play with brushes instead of sticks so his drumming wouldn't disturb the neighbors, amazingly. It turned out the brushes brought out a new dimension in the song and helped them find the mood that they imagined.
Oh, I've seen fire and I've seen rain.
There was no bass on the track. Bobby West played double bass in place of a standard bass guitar, to underscore the bottom note melancholy of Fire and Rain.
I've seen sunny days that I thought would never end.
While the melody for the track was admittedly built around a chord sequence James took from something his brother Alexander had created, borrowing his brother's riff was a tribute to the love and admiration that James had for the musicianship of his elder sibling. After the album was submitted to Warner Brothers, it seemed that JT was going to be met with a similar fate that his debut album had on the defunct Apple label. The title track was launched as the lead single from Sweet Baby James, but it went nowhere.
Rockabye, Sweet Baby James.
Now, fortunately, Fire and Rain came next as the second single, and that song just took off on the radio, unsurprisingly. James Taylor had finally found his breakthrough, one of the crown jewels, let me say it again, of the great American songbook, no doubt.
See you somehow one more time again now.
The glorious voice of James Taylor makes him one of the most distinctive and just magnetic interpreters of songs that he neither wrote nor was the first to record. It's inspired renditions of songs like You've Got a Friend,
I'll be there, you got a friend,
Handyman,
I'm your handyman,
How Sweet It Is.
How sweet it is to be in love life.
And Up on the Roof.
On my roof.
But the full effect of the deep substance inside the music and artistry of the great James Taylor rises and sets with his signature composition, Fire and Rain.
Take good money to see fire and rain.
Let there be no doubt. It's hard to imagine, and I just shudder to think it. But it's very likely that without Fire and Rain, there wouldn't be the James Taylor that we know and love. Honestly, without the hardships he faced as a young man, the song may never have materialized at all, at least not with the same blow-by-blow truthfulness that makes it so very impactful. Isn't that interesting? No one except James himself will ever know the extent of the torment and struggle that he went through to acquire the inspiration to come up with such a beautiful and powerful classic. But because of the courage and the strength that he exerted, he was able to create a song that has become a cocoon for us as listeners, to wrap around our tragedies, our frailties, our sorrows, to transform us into survivors. Once again, it's the human spirit that ultimately prevails. Thanks again, JT. Leave us a comment about your experience with this song. How has this song pulled you out of the fire? What are your thoughts on James Taylor as an artist, as a songwriter, an artist I sincerely hope to interview one day? It'd be a dream interview. Share in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. If you enjoy our videos, we would invite you to become a subscriber. Help us keep the music alive. Go to our Patreon. Help us curate this history. Again, help us keep the music alive. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.